10 things you didn't know about the transatlantic slave trade. Hello explorers, welcome to another informative video presented to you by the Explorer. In this video, we shall take you back centuries to a dark time in history to bring out 10 things you probably didn't know about the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade involved the transportation by slave traders of enslaved African people mainly to the Americas. The slave trade regularly used the triangular trade route and its Middle Passage, and supposedly existed from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The vast majority of those who were enslaved and transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa, sold by other West Africans or by half-European merchant princes, while in a small number were captured directly by the slave traders in coastal raids and brought to the Americas. Except for the Portuguese, European slave traders generally did not participate in the raids because life expectancy for Europeans in sub-Saharan Africa was less than 1 year during the period of the slave trade because of malaria. Ship owners regarded the slaves as cargo to be transported to the Americas as quickly and cheaply as possible to be sold as labor on several plantations, as well as domestic servants. The first Africans kidnapped to the English colonies were classified as indentured servants, with a similar legal standing as contract-based workers coming from Britain and Ireland. However, by the middle of the 17th century, slavery had hardened as a racial caste, with African slaves and their future offspring being legally the property of their owners. In the early 21st century, several governments issued apologies for the transatlantic slave trade. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our videos. Despite the loads of information out there are several things about this dark time which many of us may or may not still know about. We were able to narrow this into 10 things you probably didn't know about the transatlantic slave trade. Number 1. The transatlantic slave trade was not only a triangular trade. The triangular trade wasn't always triangular, as it is mostly asserted, because it also took a bilateral form. We commonly think of the Atlantic slave trade as a three-leg affair where slavers sailed from European ports carrying manufactured goods, traded those goods for captives on the African coast, and then sailed to the New World, sold their prisoners, and returned to Europe, completing the triangle. But much of the trade to Brazil, however, was bilateral, where slavers left Rio de Janeiro, headed to Angola, and came straight back to Brazil. What's more, there were many other countries and groups involved in the dark trade who did not necessarily take the triangular route. Number 2. It started long before the date believed. The Spanish merchant Juan de Cordoba is believed to have first transported captured Africans to the Americas in 1502. The first slave voyage direct from Africa to the Americas is believed to have sailed in 1526. But then even before, Africans were brought over as slaves directly from Europe, and native inhabitants of Americas were enslaved by European explorers. The Portuguese began trafficking African captives in the 1440s, long before the Wars of the Roses had begun in England. But it wasn't initially a transatlantic trade, as in the early days, enslaved Africans were brought to Portugal or to Atlantic islands like Madeira to work in agriculture. This indicates that the slave trade started long before the recorded time. Number 3. The number of Africans traded is much higher than projected by historians. Because of inadequate records, the number of people taken from Africa through enslavement remains unknown. Based on the shipping records, historians estimate that between 9 million and 12 million people were taken out of Africa by European slave traders and delivered alive on the other side of the Atlantic. An untold number, however, died resisting capture in the slave raids, died during the forced march to the coastal regions, died in slave forts while awaiting transport, and also died en route as they traveled across the ocean. The lowest number of the total loss of life is estimated to be around 20 million people, hence the numbers written down are much lower than the actual figures. Number 4. The journey was brutal on both the passengers as well as the sailors. A triangular trade route known as the Middle Passage, through which slaves were transported, was long and extremely deadly. Depending on the weather, this voyage could take between 3 to 6 months, but by the end of the slave era, it took 6 weeks or less due to faster ships. The passage was so brutal that the ships not only lost many of the people being transported as slaves, but the crew as well. The mortality rate for sailors and slave ships was approximately 20%. Slave ships varied in size and passengers' capacity, but they all shared the common trait of being inhumanly brutal. African slaves spent most of their days below deck in cramped quarters and were brought on deck only for short periods of forced exercise. Research published in 1794 calculated that a man was given a space of 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, a woman 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, and girls 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air below deck was hot, stale, and filled with incessant smell of vomit, sweat, sickness, and death. Water was restricted to 24 ounces a day, and the diet consisted mainly of horse beans and rice. Number 5. Most of the slaves never went to America first. Prior to 1518, the Spanish monarchy refused to allow slaves to be transported directly from the continent of Africa because of a fear they would introduce non-Christian religious practices to native populations in America. Only a tiny percentage of the Africans came directly to North America, as the vast majority of African slaves were first sent to the Caribbean and South America, with most half of all slaves transported from Africa sent to Brazil. That changed on August 18, 1518, when King Charles V granted a charter to Lorenzo de Gorevot to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish American colonies. The Spanish king circumvented the law established by his grandparents by allowing slaves to be converted to Christianity during the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. This action led to a broad expansion of the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. Number 6. The average cost of a slave in America in 1850 was $400. It is not even possible to fathom the thoughts that there was a time when a price tag was placed on a human being, but that is one of the dreadful things that came with the transatlantic slave trade. Across Europe and the Americas, slaves were sold like goods and services in our markets today. The price placed on the slaves depended on their gender, color, strength, time, and also depending on the country. The average cost of a slave in America in 1850 was about $400, which is about $12,000 in today's money. Number 7. There was an internal slave trade within America long after the slave trade was abolished. The transatlantic slave trade that brought slaves to the United States was dwarfed by the internal domestic slave trade. Even after Congress passed the act prohibiting importation of slaves, which took effect in 1808, the domestic slave trade grew as the African slave trade tripled up to the period of the Civil War. Approximately 1.2 million men, women, and children, most of whom born in America, were displaced by this domestic slave trade. Number 8. There were other slaves besides those who suffered the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was only about half the total slave trade out of Africa. From AD 650 to 1900, Islamic traders were estimated to have exported 10 million slaves into Northern Africa, Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, and India. They were shipped across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Many millions more were also enslaved but kept on the continent of Africa. Number 9. The oppressors were compensated where slave trade was abolished. The end of any oppressing act means that the act has been seen as a bad thing to humanity, and so was supposed to be the end of the slave trade. Those to be compensated are supposed to be the oppressed, but in the case of the transatlantic slave trade, the oppressor got compensated. As far-fetched as it may sound, when Britain abolished slavery, compensation was paid to 46,000 slave owners, but on the other hand, the 800,000 freed slaves received nothing. If that was not the height of ironic arrogance, then words are still missing to explain the motive behind such a move by the British government. Number 10. During a Roman festival, slaves and their owners swapped roles. Saturnalia was an ancient Roman festival in honor of the god Saturn, held on 17th December of the Julian calendar, and later expanded with festivities through to the 23rd of December. The holiday was celebrated with a sacrifice at the temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum, and a public banquet, followed by private gift-giving, continual partying, and a carnival atmosphere that overturned Roman social norms. Gambling was permitted, and masters provided table service for their slaves. A common custom was the election of a king of the Saturnalia, who would give orders to people which were to be followed and preside over the merrymaking. During this ancient Roman festival, slaves and their owners swapped roles, as it was seen as a time of liberty for both slaves and free men alike. There you have it, explorers. Those were the 10 things you didn't know about the transatlantic slave trade. Thanks for watching this video, and if you did enjoy this video, do well to give it a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe and share with your friends.